Well, hello, everybody. I am gonna shut the door if that's okay,
Yeah,
if you don't mind, just to,
we will start in just a second.
sorry. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm hoping that this will be a bit of an interactive conversation about this topic because it's been something that I've been thinking about certainly very much. And I've been having lots of conversations with colleagues about their students and, just this whole subject. So I hope that we can have some good discussion today. John, if you wouldn't mind going to the next one. If you would like to download these slides, there's a QR code right there for you to do so. So I'll wait a moment so everybody can do that if you want, and then we will kind of get into it.
Okay, I see the cameras are down. Did that work for everyone?
I hope so, because I tried a different one.
Okay. So we can move on.
Thank you. Okay, so I want to start by just sort of generally talking about my own kind of thoughts and feelings about generative AI and how I was really worried about the ways my students would react. So immediately, when ChatGPT became a thing, I got really nervous because I figured that all of my students immediately were going to use it for everything and that I was going to lose my job in like 6 months because writing would disappear. But since then, it's become more and more clear to me that my students, just like us, have really varied opinions about generative AI tools and technology. So I did find a couple of semi-recent surveys and reports about student attitudes. These are, beyond the observations that I've seen in my classroom, obviously. And everything here is linked also. I also have a link or a list of all the references at the very end of this presentation. But a Best Colleges survey in November 2023 showed that the majority of students, well, more than half of students say that using AI on schoolwork or exams counts as cheating or plagiarism. A different report said that approximately 50% of respondents expressed concerns about AI and academic dishonesty. And Stanford conducted a big survey that suggests cheating concerns are somewhat misdirected and that as of right now, and I think this survey was done at the end of 2023, AI is not increasing the frequency of cheating.
Right. In general, the research suggests that cheating levels are about the same. They've just changed in terms of the tools. Students have shifted from using paid tools such as Chegg to using AI if they are going to cheat. But again, most students do recognize that using it to submit work as their own is inappropriate. But they're also facing quite a bit of uncertainty about what's expected in classes because we don't always provide them with clear guidelines, and the guidelines often vary from class to class. And it is really important that we talk about AI.
So I'll say, so I taught in the EOP summer program in July, and I integrated AI tools quite a bit into that program. And we had a lot of conversations in class about generative AI tools. And I was really interested to talk with my students. And I will say that probably a third of students in the room were confidently saying, I am not interested in using this technology. Like I will use it for classroom exercises because, I want to be like a good sport and whatever else, but I am not planning on using these tools in my writing. Like beyond this, I'm just not interested. And their reasons really varied. Some of them expressed concerns about the environmental impact that generative AI tools have, right? Like on our planet. Other students were saying that because they were really not sure about what was okay and what wasn't okay, that made them really nervous and they were disinclined to use them. Other students were interested in producing more creative work and they didn't want to use it for those sorts of reasons. Then probably like the other third was like, I could take it or leave it, like I could use it with guidance. I think that it's kind of fun, but I'm still really nervous about violating intellectual integrity and being accused of academic dishonesty. And then the last third was like, oh, this is really fun. I think I would use this like on a regular basis. So my students were really, really split on how they felt about generative AI. And I would love to hear from other people who are here what your students have said or what you've heard your students talking about when it comes to these tools.
Cool.
Okay, fine.
May I go?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the reason that you mentioned about students' attitude toward AI, I think all those also reflect in my classes. Actually, I teach public relation writing and also survey of public relations, basically fundamental classes in public relations. So that's require, well, we do have expectation for writing. So, so when we talk about AI, actually this semester particularly, I intentionally introduced AI, even required them to do for their class activities, especially, so that I know, so which route they're going, how far they are, and so that I can integrate. But it seems like, a group of students, they are resistant, is from the talk, they're kind of worried about their future, like in the job market. If they use AI right now, maybe they will not be able to achieve the learning goals, and which will affect in the job market at the intern. So that's as a few students I feel. I mean it's similar attitude toward even social media. Some student they feel social media is destructive to their academic performance, so they do not use it at all. So I don't know, it seems like similar sounding I'm hearing from my classes as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thinking about the job market, I think that's a really good thing to mention also. Most of the classes that I've talked about generative AI tools with have been like the EOP students were, most recent this summer. But then before that, I was teaching a general education course where I didn't have a whole bunch of students who were specifically thinking about their careers. They were mostly thinking about generative AI getting through English 102. So I really liked listening to you talk about your students who are thinking about like their career sort of beyond what they're doing right now. Thank you.
Anyone else with comments?
I would just note that I think, you mentioned the tools change, but the basic percentage that are using those tools in unethical ways, be it Chegg.com or AI, which for people who don't like AI, the silver lining is it will drive Chegg out of business. They've already basically fired their question answers and switched to AI, and it's terrible. So it's nice. Anyway, but I think it's about what are they respecting what they do. So, the fact that as an assignment that a student really maybe sees as more authentic, even if they don't even classify it as authentic, they're much less likely to use it. But I think, for example, online classes that have employed discussion forums to varying degrees of success, I'll admit, they like to see that as busy work. And anything they see busy work, they will use a tool to actually try and do that work. So I think, yeah, the use of AI, I mean, there are situations where it'll give better or worse results for one thing, but this situation of a learning activity that they don't really respect, for a better word, or they don't see as something that's actually to aid their learning, they'll outsource it in a way that's labor and time saving for them. So I really think it can vary by the tool as well.
I think you put that really well, Liz, because it shows how that this is not just like a problem with one solution. You know what I mean? It's definitely a multifaceted thing. We have to approach this in a few different ways. But I'm glad that you brought that up because it's not just yes, it's fun or no, it's not. It's also them looking at sort of like the intrinsic value to what they're learning and how to go about it. Yeah.
Right. And they're like the benefits of doing an econometric paper on my own and learning how to do this and all of that. Plus, I don't know that I can replicate an econometric study. What do you think? Is it good enough yet? They're just going to find out.
Not yet. Not yet.
But
it could help them design a study.
Right. Help them design. And that's, and then I think it is, you mentioned instructors, and I think, it really behooves governance this year to really kind of take the academic policy we have and make sure AI is in there. But really, every department should be requiring some sort of AI statement in their syllabus for their faculty. And not a universal one, right?
Right.
There's no, I would resent a university policy about AI that says everything goes or nothing goes, or it's okay for this or that. I think it's got to be an instructor-led decision.
It
Very
should vary with the learning objectives of the course, and some of that could be discussed in class because students are concerned about AI, what it might mean to the future. We do have to prepare them for a world in which they will be working with AI tools or competing against AI tools, and they should be aware of that, and they need to know at least the very basics of how it could be used, and a discussion of how AI might be relevant to the disciplines that students are working in or their future careers might be useful, because it does put in perspective the issue of skill development versus becoming more efficient. And that's, I think, a worthwhile discussion to have, but it has to vary from class to class, because depending on what you're training students to do, AI could completely replace that learning, or it could be a useful complement for it. And that's going to vary from course to course, even within a discipline, and not just across disciplines.
Definitely. Does anybody else on Zoom have anything that you'd like to add? Anything that your students have said about how they feel about AI?
Lynn?
Yeah, I think all these comments are good, and I agree with Liz about busy work in class. And I've talked a little bit with students. I've actually had a student use AI to actually cheat on a paper because she panicked, right? So I suspect that the same reasons that students use, copy and paste from a website, or don't cite something, or have someone else write a paper for them, is going to be the same when using AI. They're just going to use it if they're panicked and they don't know what else to do. So I think revamping our assignments so that they can understand what they're doing, I think is a better option. I have made a statement again this semester that I'm not going to let them use AI, but because I'm still reading about it. I'm in the CELT group this semester, so I want to learn more about it, and I want to sort of develop assignments that might make better use of it.
Just two other thoughts. One is on discussions. One way of avoiding some of that is by moving to hypothesis or perusal for discussions, because it's actually much easier to just directly comment than it is to extract some of the material from the PDF and then determine where it would be appropriate to plug it back in. So generally, students who use annotation tools as a basis of discussion we don't see as much use of AI in there. And the other comment I was going to make about with larger projects is because students tend to cheat when, as Lynn said, when a deadline is rapidly approaching, scaffolding the assignments as much as possible reduces those incentives by having students do it in a series of small steps, so they don't fall behind in the same way, and it's manageable, and they don't have to worry about staying all night trying to do a semester's worth of work.
Yeah. Okay. So connected to everything that we were just talking about is our first slide on setting expectations for your students. So this is what I personally think about these sorts of things. I make sure that I talk with my students about my feelings about generative AI. It's something that I do upfront and usually very early in a course. They notice. I've had a statement on my syllabus for quite a while now about generative AI. So usually they'll do a syllabus recon on the first day in my class, and they'll notice that the statement is there, and then that gives us a really nice opportunity to talk about it. But I think it's really important for them to know how you feel about generative AI, whether or not you use it, and why or why not. Because being transparent with them, I think to hear an expert in a field, especially if it's a field that they want to pursue, talk about generative AI in that field, I think that's really important for them. When I'm teaching creative writing, I make a point to talk about, how yes, it's a tool, but then we also connect that to many other things that is connected to generative AI, like the writer's strike, right? And how, okay, let's look at an example of like a short story that a generative AI tool produces versus something that's created by a human, right? And what the differences are. And I think that's really important for them to see those differences and for us to talk about them in that kind of context. So I would encourage everybody, you know, I think it also makes our students, it helps them understand where you're at right from the beginning. And one of the biggest concerns that students have spoken with me about is not knowing. I don't know what's okay. I don't know what's not okay, because like Liz said, I think it's really important that we all have our own autonomy, that we can choose how we want to integrate these tools and to what degree. But that also makes it really hard for our students because we're all very different. So, John, did you have anything to add before we go to the next?
No, I
bullet?
think the next bullet point is.
Sure. Okay.
Worth.
Yeah. So, since your feelings and all of the AI guidelines are unique from class to class, you know, try to set your expectations for your students in as transparent a way as possible. So we've talked a little bit up to this point about the importance of statements on syllabi, and make sure that they know that it's there. You know, it's great to put it on there, but we should also, you know, they should know that it's there. And then one of the things that I've done almost right from the beginning, after ChatGPT was created, was I started putting statements on individual assignments so that I could guide my students. Okay, like, yes, I know we did an exercise where we did this, but you know, now for this assignment, I want you to do something a little bit different. And a lot of the times the statements on my assignment sort of like build what they can do with the AI tool. So it starts out with something like super basic, and then I allow them to do a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, which has been kind of a nice way for me to align assignments with what they're doing, what they're working on. And my assignments in most of my classes are scaffolded, like John mentioned, and that works out really, really nicely because they can build with me and with the tool and come up with their own ideas as they keep going.
And I'd really like to emphasize that second point. Putting the information on individual assignments is really helpful because students don't always go back and check their syllabus. And they also are in generally 5 classes, which often have very different rules, and the rules may be changing in each of those as we learn more about the use of AI in instruction. So putting it right at the top of the assignment. In general, you know, I'd recommend the TILT approach from Marianne Winklemas, where you put all that information in the assignment, because among other things, it reduces equity gaps, because first-gen students are more likely not to be going back to the syllabus and looking at those things, because often they've never seen a syllabus until they're freshmen, and they don't always recognize how it's being used, you know. So, you know, those t-shirts about it's in the syllabus isn't really very helpful for a student who's not used to having a syllabus, because they haven't seen them until they arrived here, and we don't always explain to them what those syllabi are for.
I'll add also that my summer program students made a point to tell me more than once how, and this is almost a direct quote from them, refreshing it was that we were talking about AI in class. They were like, my high school teachers pretended it didn't exist. So they were like, thank you for talking with us about this, because
Streisand effect is over.
Yeah.
It's out there, people.
Yeah.
That Streisand thing is over. That was like 2 years ago. So talk about it. And I would just say a visual, like there's the academic integrity statement of my syllabus got expanded for AI, and I have this, you may not use, and I have a, you know, red X, or, you know, and I have a bulleted list of this is awful, you know, this is bad. And then I have little green check, and I said, but you use it for this, and then you can ask me. And I repeat it on every single instruction of every single graded piece of work in my classes. That's one change I made for the fall of 2023 with AI and all that. But, you know, they're visual learners, John. That's way well done.
That's
everybody.
another
So,
discussion.
okay. Yeah, that was for you, but they're not. But I think actually that kind of grabbed your attention. You know, the red X and the green check that I use seem to actually kind of grab their attention. And you're right, the first day of class, I use at least half the class as a syllabi day. I've always preferred that because I think everyone should be on the same page of knowledge as well. But I think I think this is a larger academic dishonesty issues when they've arisen and people come talk to me or ask me about it in terms of governance and our policies, how many people don't really take the time to take the university policy and interpret it for their class? This is the university policy. In my class, there are quizzes or homeworks or reflection papers or whatever. And this is the boundary of what is cheating and what isn't. And this is what I'll do if I make a finding. And it's, you know, and while there's a university policy, you really have a responsibility in your course to interpret any of those things for exactly what you're grading them on in the course.
Okay, Lynn?
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Liz, about this, and John about having an assignment that highlights what your policy is about AI. And what I've done also is make them, after the paper, they have a checklist for me to complete to say, here's what I found, here's how much time I spent on the assignment, and then here's what was challenging. And then they have to do another checklist where they have to make sure they have all the elements of the assignment completed, including I have not used AI, I have not plagiarized, I have done the citations correctly. So I think it's not only important for them to have that assignment, you know, reminder at the beginning, but also to have something at the end to say, did you reflect on your paper? Did you actually do everything you were supposed to do?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Let's keep going. Okay, I think this is my last, oh no, it's not. All right, so as we continue to talk about, you know, setting expectations, it's what's really interesting is, you know, if you walk into a room full of students, you know, they can all tell you generally what generative AI is, or generally, I'm sorry, what generative AI is, but they don't know a lot of the other things that kind of come along with it. They're like, oh yeah, like, you know, it can do this, it can do this. Some of them know quite a bit more, but their knowledge as a whole, I am finding anyway, I'd be curious to hear what other people have observed, is still pretty limited about like the other stuff, right? Like if we're thinking about the ethical considerations, you know, and like if you ask them, okay, what does it mean? Like if you take this text that was published in a database through the library and you put it into ChatGPT and then ask ChatGPT to summarize it, is that ethical, right? And they're like, oh, I didn't think about it that way, right? Or, you know, the bias thing I think is coming to light a little bit more now. I think they're talking about that more. The environmental impact a little bit more, but not too much. So I think it's important for them to understand how this works in at least a general sense, so that they can make more of their own decisions about like whether or not they want to use it, right? I think that sort of thing is important. And I read something not that long ago that talked about, okay, like, do we think as humans, is it important for us to know when something was created by AI or not? Like, is there a line? You know what I mean? Should we know that it was made by a human or not? And is that important? And the example that I cited there, or that's linked there, is a new tool. Well, it's not that new. This was from 2023, but there's a new tool that uses AI to generate obituaries, which I thought was really interesting, and would also make for a really fascinating conversation in class, right? Like, so this company is called Empathy, and the whole purpose of this AI is to write obituaries. Like, is that something we should be using AI for, right? If you read the article, it argues that writing obituaries can be really hard and it can require a lot of emotional labor. But just because it's hard and requires emotional labor, should we rely on AI to do it? I think those are important conversations for us to have.
If only that one provost who had sent out the AI generated obituary to the campus had this app, it may have come out better.
Right?
Well, I mean, this kind of rings true too, because my father-in-law died suddenly in September of 2021. And, you know, there were surrounded, a lot of his family weren't people that actually write a lot for work, and they don't. And so I said, you know, so we're all kind of doing a task, and I said, I'll do this. And I wrote the obituary. And then 6 weeks later on that same side, my niece would die of an opiate overdose. And, you know, her parents could not begin to write that, right? And it became my side gig, my unpaid side gig. But I mean, it really became, but I'm gonna believe what an active service or how hard it is at the time. Particularly, you know, there's a lot of families and communities that don't sit down and write for a living. We don't write letters anymore. That's not really a thing.
Yep.
And so that is actually, I mean, it's an interesting one example, because I think it's an example of maybe, I don't know if I call it a lost art or a lost skill. But you know, I think that's something where people, you know, looking for a tool who don't necessarily have this community. I mean, there's actually a community of writers that can be connected, that turns out helps parents who lost children, and will help them write obituaries, particularly with drug addiction. Because, you know, there are ways you go. Do you talk about the dangers of the road they went down, or do
Right.
you really talk about the positive of their life and have, you know, and things like that. But and it's interesting, AI wouldn't necessarily know how to do that. And but it's actually kind of this very specialized tool at a very hard part in their life. So I mean, I actually had seen that service and looked at that example. So, but I think ethical considerations and work with your students. If you're using it, students should know what it does and doesn't do well. As an economics teacher, people have actually tried to take a time value of money question, which is internal rate of return coupon bonds, for those of you on there that don't know what I'm talking about. And you know, it's a quantitative question, and they'll put it into AI, you know, desperation or whatever, and it spits out a beautiful step-by-step confident of how you solve the problem, and then spit out a number that is completely random. It's like, well, this coupon bond has a 367% interest rate. It really doesn't. And so, you know, but that was, you know, it was a limit, the limitations, right, of what, because I started getting these answers. I'm like, oh, you know how to solve this, but it's not right. But so I think it's ethics and also limits. I think in a famous example, David Andrews' wife was being introduced by a grad student, and he attributed this quote to her that she never said, because I guess he asked AI to help him write it. And this is an older generation of it, but you know, AI made up a quote.
Getting better with those.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was probably at least 2 years ago. This happened.
The limitations, I'll say, and then we could go, if, I don't know if anybody on Zoom has some input, but the limitations are especially interesting. When I talk to my students about, like the hallucinations, like when ChatGPT or anything else, makes something up that it doesn't know the answer to, they're like, what? And that really surprises them. So I do think that one is an important one to bring up. Does anybody on Zoom have any input here? How do you talk to your students about AI, or like, what do you think they should really know?
So I think it's important to talk to students how it actually works. There's actually an NPR episode where they do a very good job of explaining how like the generative AI tools work. And so I suggest that to students. I haven't actually listened to it with them together, but it might be something I consider doing in the future. And then in the syllabus, I have actually like a table of levels of AI use, because it's not as simple as like yes, no. There are different like degrees to which that you can actually use the tool. And so like the way I have it set up is up to level 3 is okay, but 4, where the AI is generating substantial amounts of the content, that's not okay. That's not going to be okay. And 5 is where AI completely creates the content through a series of revisions that you do by like altering your prompt or asking it to make adjustments to previous outputs. And that's also not okay for the course. But I think it's important to acknowledge kind of the nuance that exists in the extent of use, and to be kind of transparent with students about what is okay and what's not okay. Because like level 1 would be something like just grammar or spelling tools, which all of us take for granted now. I think everybody uses those, but that's kind of almost like a primitive form of these tools.
I really like that. Like was that Peter?
Yes.
Yeah, I really
Sorry.
like that. I'm sorry, I can't see any of you on this screen, but I really like what you said, Peter, like doing like the levels. I think that's a really good way to go about it. So speaking
Lynn?
go ahead, John.
Yeah, just a brief comment is, for me at least, it's about helping students find their own voice, right? That's they have to learn how to struggle through finding their own way of communicating, whether it's through oral communication, written communication. So that's something I emphasize with them, that it's just really important for them to figure out how they communicate and what kinds of expectations they have for their own way to communicate. So, because using AI as a replacement is not really the point. It can enhance, it can help you, it's a tool. It shouldn't be a replacement for your voice.
Well, I would say in economics, it's a complement, not a substitute. So I try and tell them. But I mean, I liked what you said about voice, because I think one of the more useful AI exercises is, you can explain something, an economic concept, and I can say, explain it like you're a stuffy professor with a stuffy professor audience, and explain what marginal utility is, right? And then they can do another prompt that said, explain marginal utility like you're explaining it to your mom who wants to know what you're doing in college, who's never taken an economics class. And then so you have two different explanations of the same concept. And now you can ask them just, it's a think, pair, share, or some kind of exercise where they can compare and contrast and say, how did the voice affect these answers? Because I think modern AI can answer that question very well. I think you'd agree, John, if you asked them to explain a basic explanation of marginal utility. So it's definitely there that it can do that very well. But if you asked it to do a specific voice, and I kind of got that idea from Stephanie, it was Stephanie's summer and the worksheet she gave about prompts and how the voice and how you should add, who it's coming from and the kind of differences that can come up. And now they can identify, Lynn, how voice affects how you convey the exact same piece of information. And then begin to think about their voice and which voice did they more agree with and what elements and why.
Yep. But voice can be it's a tricky thing, right? To get a handle on. So I love that. That's a wonderful way to show them.
The hardest, kind of the hardest part for students in writing is getting started because they don't know their voice and they think it has to sound like pseudo smart intellectual for the professor to read it, or the professor will look down on that voice. And I think that's very hard for students. And I think sometimes AI, I'm like, why don't ask AI to start and give me a 5-sentence introductory paragraph to what I want to do.
Yep.
And I said, now start with that, make it your own, and now you're on your way. Because, I think faculty would say the hardest thing is getting started, right? You find every excuse. Oh, I need a cup of coffee. Oh, look at that load of laundry, right? We have all excuses to not start our writing project.
It's true. I used to do something in creative writing courses where we were doing things on voice where I would show pictures. I would put a picture up just from a basic Google image search, and I would have them I'm like, okay, tell me about this person, right? And we would create a whole persona, right? Based off of this random person who we pulled up, the poor guy. And they would do that. And then I would show them a different picture of somebody totally, somebody totally different. And we would do something there. And that was really helpful. But I think still seeing, right, the difference in a voice that's written instead of coming up with it in your head and then you trying to write it down can be a really effective way to teach it, which is a hard thing. Go ahead.
The temptation for students, though, is to jump right ahead and get the final output. And it's really important to emphasize to students the importance of developing their voice or developing the basic skills and the discipline, because for them to be able to evaluate the output of AI tools, they have to have enough expertise to be able to reasonably do that, and reminding them of the importance of developing those basic skills so that they're not just blindly accepting what's spit out by these things. I think is really important as part of the conversation.
I completely agree. You have to understand, you have to have some kind of knowledge base, right, in order to kind of move forward. So Liz already talked about this a little bit, but it's in here anyway. So one of the things that I like to do in pretty much all of my classes is actually show, so we have the intellectual integrity statement in our syllabi, and it's just a sentence or two. Right. So I like to go to the website and actually, and you don't have to click on this if you don't want to, but you can if you want. Yeah, there it is. Hey, one of my students over the summer was like, is that Abraham Lincoln?
Yes.
So
our first president.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but I like to go here and actually show them what the policy looks like. And we we spend a decent chunk of time kind of going through looking at, the different kinds of intellectual integrity violations. So we talk about the difference between cheating, between fabrication and falsification, between plagiarism, and copyright infringement, right? Those are the big four. So we talk about what each of those are and what they all mean. We look at the examples that are on the website also. And then I tell them, like, listen, it doesn't explicitly say generative AI like at this moment in time, but generative AI is technically a violation of all of these things. And we talk about how that is after I give them kind of like an introduction to generative AI kind of like talk. So we talk about how generative AI does violate intellectual integrity in these different ways. And then I scroll down and show them the different sanctions and show them sort of like some of the potential penalties for violating intellectual integrity. And many of them have never seen it before, right? And it's a really eye-opening moment for them to say, like, listen, I'm not just going to make you redo the assignment. Like, you could fail the class, you could be reported to the dean's office, like you could, like, these things could happen. So I think, like, just while we're being transparent, it's important for them to know that all of these things exist. They're all in writing. We have policies for all of them, right? And they can go look at this stuff anytime, to see that it is real.
Right, and you also could break it down, because I think what I say basically summarize in my intellectual integrity is basically anything you do that's outsourcing the work of there's work of this course for learning activities require work that leads to meeting the learning outcomes. And when you outsource parts of that in ways that you actually try and document achieving a learning outcome that you haven't done, that's cheating. Whether you outsource it to a robot or an actual person, or living or dead, and in terms of plagiarism, right? Then you've actually violated academic integrity. And so these are all, the examples and the wording, on the website is all just kind of breaking down to say this.
Yep.
Right? This doesn't represent my own work. And in the cases where I've built upon the work, have I cited and acknowledged that work?
Yep.
And that's really what it comes down to.
Yep. Everybody on Zoom doing okay?
Nods.
Okay.
Silence is gold.
So last week I popped by Professor Juliet Giglio's screenwriting class to talk about the Writing Center. And I was like casually chatting with some of her students about like generative AI. And I just really liked this anecdote, so that's why it's here. The student I was talking to compared AI, and he wants to, he's a creative writer, wants to write for a living, compared AI tools sort of to like IKEA furniture. That it's like a decent, like, quick fix, but it's not the same as something that's handcrafted or handmade. And I thought that was just a really, really interesting way to make the comparison, especially if you are just using it to solve a problem, really, really fast, right? And he talked also about how, he wants to learn the different creative writing things so that he can be really good in his field upon graduation. So I thought that was just an interesting sort of thing. And again, it connects to the thing that we were talking about at the beginning about how our students do have different thoughts and opinions about these tools and how they might impact them. So, and this we already kind of mentioned, but it's on the slide, so I'm going to say it anyway. We were talking about originality and voice and what is valued in our different disciplines, right? So AI tools can mimic voice and show really good examples, but in my personal opinion, they can't replace like a novel that's written by a human, right? I think anyway, at this time. In another year, we'll revisit.
A writer
But-
friend of mine who's published quite a few books said that, she writes the whole thing herself, but she will use AI tools to generate alternative scene descriptions.
Yeah.
Just to shorten the process a little bit for things that are more background and less essential to the plot and the,
Yep.
the originality of the story.
And like, I love AI for brainstorming. I use AI for brainstorming the most, and regularly, for all sorts of different things. It's great for generating ideas, helping me get started. Thinking about showing examples. I think it's wonderful for all of those sorts of things. And I talk to students about that also, but, ultimately what we value most in my discipline is like things like originality and voice, and how some things humans are still doing better than AI. Does anybody online have anything that you would say to your students that connects to like the purpose and engagement in your classes? If not, that's okay.
Hearing none.
I mean, generally, most of my students believe that AI is just a tool like any other tool. So there's, they consider sometimes the tool can be used, not necessarily replacing the entire idea what they're supposed to be doing. So that kind of gives a purpose how they want to use.
Thank you.
Welcome.
All right, so this is like the $200 slide. So even though we did all of the things, right, and we talked about AI and we told our students, like the good and the bad and the ugly, and like also did exercises in class and we gave them guidelines and, like the whole thing, what do we do when they use AI anyway, like in ways that we told them not to? So I found a couple of different examples, and then I also have some stories, and I would like to hear any stories from anybody else. Do we go till 150, John, or does it go till
I
2?
think we can go to 2.
Okay. Well,
Yeah,
okay,
because the class period
Said
goes
1 to
until
2.
that's
2:00.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Self-email.
1 to 2. All right,
Yeah.
perfect. So this first one that I found from this faculty member said that they usually reach out via email to ask to talk with the student on the phone or via Zoom or whatever. If a student doesn't respond, I email specific questions about the content of the paper and say that I need these questions to be answered before I can grade their work. So that was one comment. Another comment, ask the student to expand on the ideas they wrote about, like with things like tell me more about whatever, or what were you thinking when you wrote this or whatever. So just ask the student to elaborate a little bit more.
Which AI can do quite well.
Yeah, yes, it can. And then the last, I'm going to hold off on the last one for a second because I do want to share probably my big takeaway story from this summer. I've had a few, right? And I know, John, you've had a couple also because we've
I've had
talked
quite a
about
few,
them.
yeah.
Yeah. But one that really stuck out to me this summer was we were doing a scaffolded writing assignment. So the first part of the writing assignment was like super casual, right? It was literally just like generally talk to me about the topic you're thinking about writing about, right? So it was super, super general, really low stakes, basically like turn it in and I'll give you an A, right? Like we're just getting started. So they all did that. And then the next part of the assignment was looking for sources that they could potentially use, right? That would connect to this idea. And one of my students submitted summaries of sources that sounded really different from the person who wrote the original thing. Like completely, totally different. So I was going through, I graded everything in Brightspace, and this student, I left a 0 on the paper and I said, hey, I have a couple of questions for you about your assignment. Come chat with me, you know what I mean? And then I'll put a grade here, but I have questions, So the student came and talked with me and I asked a couple of just very open-ended questions, like about the sources that they had found, what they liked about those sources. And then I asked them to summarize one of the sources that they had already summarized in writing, but we were talking, right? And when he couldn't do that, I said, I'm wondering if you used any tools to help you with this assignment. Like, did you use any generative AI tools? And he said, yeah, I did. And I said, okay, like, let's talk about what that means and why that was not the best choice for this assignment and whatever else. And what was most interesting to me about the conversation that we had was at the end of the conversation, he said, how did you know? Like, how did you know it wasn't me? And I'm like, this is like 2 totally different people, right? Who wrote these things. And he told me, he apologized and said, so I told him, I'm like, you have the opportunity to redo this assignment, but I'm only going to give you half credit for redoing it. And why did you do that? Like, why did you choose to use AI? And he said, well, I put off the assignment, even though it wasn't that big of a deal. I waited and I was working on it at like 2 o'clock in the morning and I was really tired. And I thought that I would just do this to kind of get around it. So he came to my office later that afternoon and sat like directly across from me and said, like, can I sit here and do the assignment in your office, like while you're here? And I was like, yeah, no problem. He sat down, did the assignment. It took him like maybe an hour. And then at the end of the hour said, I can't believe that I didn't just do it. And like, I think it was like a happy ending, right? But like, I think it was a big moment for him to kind of see how it went, realize that he got caught, and then realize like if he had just done it the right way, then it would have been nice. That's obviously like a happy story, sort of. I have sadder stories too, and I'm sure John does also. But anybody, John, do you want to tell one and then we can
Well,
open it?
Most of the ones I've had recently, just talking to the students about it, have generally cleared it up, But I did have one that I turned in, and Paul would have seen this early on, where back in the days, the good old days, when there was a limit on the database in terms of what was available on the training database. So I had students, this was in the class in labor economics too, look at what happened to the labor force participation rate and unemployment rate in the last 3 months, giving them a link to the most current data on that, and to explain that in light of what they had just discussed in that chapter in that module of the course. And one of the students said in their response to that assignment, this was an online class, as an AI tool, I do not have access to the data available that's needed to answer this question. You can find this data at the Bureau of Labor Statistics at this URL. And all of his responses in that particular assignment were very similar because the assignments were constructed at that time so that they were not vulnerable to AI, before they had search capabilities, before they have constant updates and so forth. So it was kind of blatant. It didn't, in that case, he didn't even look at the response that he had submitted. And he wasn't doing very well in general, and he didn't do most of the work otherwise, but it was a particularly blatant example,
It's a good one.
an extreme one.
Yeah.
Usually they're not that clear. Mostly what I've just seen is an improvement in the general quality of writing and proofreading and spelling.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
Definitely. Yeah, I've had a few of those, in lower stakes assignments, but yeah, as a language learning model, I cannot express my opinion about this or that. I'm like, so,
I bet you can't.
yeah, I bet. Right. And I had someone send me an email arguing that he didn't use AI that was clearly written by AI. Right, because in particular ChatGPT does this, they actually chunk things out, about, and this and this and this, kind of like a bulleted narrative type reasoning. And so we had it, and it's sort of mashed. So I was curious, and I went to an AI and I asked the same, kind of did the prompt, suppose you're a student trying to explain to a professor you didn't use AI on an assignment, what would you do? And it was like parallel, not identical, because it doesn't work like that.
Yep.
So,
the only policies I've seen on campuses that are generally universal on the campus, and I've seen that at 6 or 7 campuses now, are ones that say AI detection tools alone
Right.
cannot be used
Yes.
to demonstrate academic dishonesty. You need other basis for that. And I think that might be at a minimum something we might want to consider here, because
we do,
they're
because
really seriously
they
flawed.
are, and they're seriously flawed, and just in general on kind of national boards and forums that deal with higher education, you also get posts from panicked students saying, I didn't use AI, but my professor ran it, and now they said I flunked, and how can I appeal this, and all of that. So
Yep.
yeah, I think that's pretty bad practice. I mean, do I use them to kind of start the conversation so I don't gaslight myself about whether or not a student wrote this? Sure, I do, but it's not even I don't actually write back a student and say this came back 98% or something like that. I really just say, this is really odd, or you're explaining why, things like that. But
And we no longer subscribe to the service that does AI detection and turn it in.
yeah,
And it wasn't because of the ethics of it, which is why many campuses have dropped it. It was because it was expensive.
right.
So, but it's probably a good thing that we no longer have that,
Right,
because
and I think it's only natural that AI evolves to escape detection of ChatGPT 0, ChatGPT, right? That's the big detector, right?
Yeah,
ChatGPT 0.
Or zero G. Either
there
one
are
of the
many
zero
of them.
GPT
There are many of
or-
them.
They-
Yeah.
They basically use what it called burstiness, and what was the other? There's like 2
Yeah.
criteria, but
Right, but as more and more AI tools come out and that use different procedures, they become less and less effective in detecting.
I think AI evolves to get away from those. Those detectors are too simplistic to be robust. Say that.
So talking to the students is probably the best way of addressing it.
I think that one's huge, right? And usually, you know, like if they can't explain something that they wrote, I mean, that's a huge I know the next slide that I have is sort of like some indicators, but does anybody on Zoom have anything that you want to share kind of connected to this? Like you suspect students are using AI tools anyway, what do you do? Cool. No problem. No problem. Oh, was there somebody?
Yes.
But yeah,
I'm sorry, I can't see
it's
you.
Mikhail again. Actually, so I like the way you said, so talking to and having a further clarification. At least what I learned from this conversation, next time I'm gonna mention in my policy that, say maybe sometimes you will be called out for explaining how, how you use ChatGPT or any AI tool. So that's one way. But another way that I used to do, so for a final project, the presentation. So I thought, so if somebody can do the presentation well, probably that could, so at least show me the learning outcome that's happening. So that's another way I do it.
Definitely. That's a great one. It's one of the things that we say in the Office of Learning Services a lot, can you explain it? Or can you present it, right? Because that's one of the best ways to show that you've learned something. So yeah, that's great. There was we don't have time to look at it now, which is okay, but in the presentation, there is a link to it, a class activity that I thought was kind of interesting. This was done by a high school teacher. I'll just kind of summarize what it was so that you know, but a high school teacher was talking with her students about, like generative AI and the quality of the outputs and things like that. And so they told her like, oh no, it's good. Like it makes such good stuff. You won't know like what it does. So she went and printed or engaged with ChatGPT for like a pretty basic prompt and printed it out, and then had a student written prompt also that she had printed out. So she had and she had 3 total, 2 written by students and 1 written by AI. And she handed out, she didn't label them. She passed them out to everybody in the class and asked the students to identify which one was written by AI. And I think it was some like insane number, like 90% of the students identified the AI generated prompt. And at the end of the activity, she said, so if you could all pick out which one was written by AI, why do you think I can't? And she said that it was a really interesting sort of activity for her students, right? To kind of see some of the patterns and whatever else. It was most likely, she didn't say if it was the free version, I'm assuming it was, but I thought it was an interesting kind of activity. All right, so it's funny that we were talking about, I feel like Liz has been like one step ahead of me like this whole presentation.
Right.
So it's funny that we were talking about detection tools and things like that. I couldn't resist this, that if you go to Turnitin's website, they do have some advice for students, like what happens if your writing is flagged as being, generated by AI when it wasn't really. And like, as a writing teacher, I couldn't resist that. Turnitin's advice was to establish your voice, to make sure that your writing style and voice are clear to your instructor. This means putting in real effort if your instructor asks for a writing sample, or putting in real effort in every assignment. When you don't take it seriously, it will be harder for the instructor to understand the unique nuances of your writing expression. For me, as a person who teaches largely a lot of first year students who are still trying to figure out like what the heck their voice is, I find this advice to be a little bit problematic. Especially, I understand not everybody teaches first year writing courses, but I think like if you are a student who's reading this advice and you haven't established your writing style, you haven't established your voice, and you're still learning, I find this to be like a little bit troublesome. I don't know. So I think it's interesting that this is Turnitin's, the plagiarism detection software's advice for students from their website. Some of the other advice was good, but this advice I did not love. And there it is.
Any other thoughts? Reactions, concerns?
Or anything that you would have liked us to talk about that we didn't, so that we can make another presentation for later.
I think it's fair to just note that a lot of the ways that we fight AAI or make it less relevant, like again, not a punitive approach, but just don't scale it. So when you have 250 students, right, some of the things that I do with AI in a class of 20 aren't going to work.
For sure.
And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, for these, this semester, I have 2 classes with only 20 students in them, right? And so bringing in AI, using it to brainstorm, things like that, worksheets kind of about, steps to get a good, to really write a good prompt to help get what you want, right? Those things can be done, but boy, when you get into classes, larger classes, I just, a lot of these things don't scale.
And a lot of it has to come down to persuasion, because students were always cheating in some way, and we're not going to eliminate that, but the more we can convince students that they're learning relevant skills and actually have them learn relevant skills that they see as relevant, the less likely it is that they'll do it.
And I would just say that to other faculty who feel overwhelmed by it. They say, well, maybe if your learning activities were authentic and your assessments were authentic, this wouldn't happen. And then again, doing authentic assessments weekly for
Is a lot
250
of work.
students
Yes.
is limited,
Yeah.
right? And
I think, I have absolutely no experience teaching to a class with 250 students in it, so I won't even pretend to go there. But I will say that I do think that our transparency makes it extra important, right? Because there will be some students, I think, in that class who will say like, okay, my instructor has said that for this class, we shouldn't use it, and I think being transparent in that way at the beginning does help set the tone and the expectations very early on.
In doing compare share, doing active learning exercises in class, leveraging peer instruction in class, doing some polls where they're going to be discussing things with each other before they vote a second time. Those are not very vulnerable. They're not as vulnerable to AI assistance.
For sure.
And at some point, we will have AI in iClicker. Once CTS finally updates the software in the classrooms. But you could always download your own version of it and have the AI capabilities there. So that has been requested before the semester. So I'm hoping that they will move on that. And the AI capabilities are mostly in generating questions if you want to generate something on the fly. So they're not terribly useful in general, but it's going to get better. What I was hoping that they would include is an AI analysis of free response questions. So if you get 200 or 300 responses coming in,
right.
it could generate a summary of all
Right.
those in
Like
nearly
I kind
real
of do that
time.
on social media and Amazon reviews and things like that, right? Where you get
Yep.
an AI summary of like that. Yeah. I do like to use the word cloud, but why is it facing the wrong way? Did you notice that? Like it's on its side. You ever use the word cloud?
Yes,
iClicker?
regularly.
Oh.
Yeah.
It's like on its, I'm like, why would that be the default?
Well, they tilt in different
I
ways.
thought I could only tilt that way. I never got it. I'm like,
Yeah, the word cloud is all we've got right there. for
right.
now
And
in
I
summary.
use the word cloud as a substitute. People look at it, pick out.
But that's an area where AI could be really useful. It was something actually that Derek Bruff demonstrated last at the CIT last spring. Okay, any other thoughts? We do have a recording of the workshop we did on authentic assessment last week, and we'll be meeting again on Thursday to talk about ways in which we can use AI tools. We can use them and students can use them to reduce some of the equity gaps in classes. So that'll be the next topic. Thank you. And our
Thank you,
reading group
everybody.
starts soon.
Yes, it does.
Next week, pretty first.
Next week, let me just stop the
Oh, I can
recording.
go look there.
Well, one of the reading groups starts next week. The problem is I don't remember which
That's okay.
one.
You gotta start reading that book.
Is it next week?
Yes, I believe